following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Thank you, Tally Olson. I am indeed back, and I'm indeed comfortably zoned. I'm in Alameda, California. I'm the Zig Zag Man. I'm right across the bay from San Francisco and across the moat from Oakland. And as advertised, I talk to some of the most interesting people on the face of the planet. And today is really no exception. I'm going to just start off by giving you a few notes of music. Here you go.
I need somebody help, not just anybody help. You know I need someone help.
See, I needed Bob Wilson to talk some Beatles, and I got him on the line. Bob Wilson, writer, and specifically a magazine writer, the magazine being the Beatles. And we're going to talk about the Beatles and a whole bunch of other stuff. Welcome to the Zone. Really privileged to have you.
I'm really happy to be here this afternoon. You're such an interesting guy, and it's an honor to be on your show.
Oh, well, you certainly overstated that one.
No.
Oh, yeah. But thank you. I appreciate that. We get along on Facebook, and you've got so much to talk about. Let's start with the Beatles a little bit. Like everybody else out there, there's that one question in my mind. Did Yoko break up the Beatles?
Well, in my point of view, I know some fans don't like to hear that, but yeah, I do think that Yoko kind of put a rift in them that they couldn't get past. And when she was dragging her bed into the studio, and John and her had gotten into harder, uglier drugs and things like that, I think it kind of sealed the Beatles' fate. Maybe they were meant to end in 1970, but I think she had a big part in that.
Okay. That's a great answer. I guess I only have one more question because one of my 10 favorite groups of all time is the Traveling Wilburys. What did you think, as a Beatle fan, what did you think of that group?
Well, I never thought that George would become the most popular Beatle for a time, but he sure did with that. The two records they put out are unforgettable, and I think all the guys involved in that, Dylan included, kind of got like a resurgence from it, and it was a wonderful couple of years that they gave us. It was, one of those things you're glad happened and you didn't see coming.
Great answer, because I play them over and over. The 2 or 3 songs are just like classics in my head, and Roy Orbison comes back, and Tom Petty, rest his soul. He passed away a few months ago, if I'm not mistaken. It just gives us an idea that mortality sucks. How about that?
You can't go wrong with that one. That's for sure.
I hate to be direct, but it really does. And the older I get, I'm reminded of what my grandmother said, the disadvantages of being the last man standing, so to speak, is that you're watching your friends, your relatives get sick, suffer, this, that, and the other thing. But on the good news, I'd rather do it on this side of the ground than...
That's a good side to be on. Instead of watching the roots of the grass, we can watch the top.
If you're in doubt, anybody in doubt out there, take it from me. If you don't believe me, tell your spiritual friends, and maybe they'll argue with me. But in addition to your Beatleism and what have you, I want to know what your writing process is. I get to know you a little bit about through that. How do you write on schedule? Do you write when the spirit hits you? Do you just take notes and then jot them down later? What's it like for you? Everybody's different.
With me, usually it's a burning need to say something that I can't. I think I'm better at writing sometimes than at speaking, and I hold those things in. I guess they stick with you for a reason that you don't consciously know. You file them away, and then at some point you see how things come together, pardon the Beatles pun, and when they start to come together and you see a little picture like a puzzle coming together, for the best things that, aren't forced and such, you put them together and you really feel them because they become part of you. So usually it hits me late at night. I'm not like a daytime guy to write. Usually when everybody else is asleep, I'll start to write. And I was lucky Beatles magazine with lovely Rita, hello Rita, has plugged my stuff and let me write for them. She's a wonderful meter maid. And thanks to her, I could get my stuff in that magazine, for which I'm grateful. And, the Beatles were with me since I was 5 years old, so, that stuff's been with me my whole life, so there's got to be something to it if you listen to it for that long.
Did your parents listen to rock and roll?
They, would put up with it when I listened to it, and my dad said the Beatles had something special when they were showing their Ed Sullivan clips on TV, but he liked Frank Sinatra. Who can blame him? And my mom liked the big band era, like Mitch Miller and Glenn Miller and those guys, stuff like that.
My uncle liked those people, and never got to me like the blues did, and Motown and rock and roll and Mose Allison and the Beatles, and we were lucky growing up. We had some great musical icons. I think the music of the 50s and 60s, early 70s and what have you, Little Feat, for up till then, just the best music in history. I'm prejudiced.
It's hard to argue with that, right?
Yeah, had my ear in the radio 24/7. If it wasn't baseball, it was music. And we both grew up in New York, specifically in Queens, so that it was a lot of top 40 on the radio.
Yeah, definitely, and it kind of pushed me into getting into like Bob Dylan. The
Right.
Beatles, I think, were better songwriters than when I was a little, when I grew up. I guess I was a kid in the 70s, and then in the 80s I was in high school in the early 80s. So I didn't really listen to too much of the top 40 stuff, but Bob Dylan, the Beatles, the Who, things like that. And then as I got a little older, I wondered who their influences were. And through that, I listened to some other people. And, you had mentioned the blues and those players that influenced Bob Dylan. And the Motown that the Beatles took quite a bit from. And, you learned about that stuff, in my case, from them.
Rolling Stones took from that group of folk as well.
Absolutely. And Chuck, and Keith Richards must have been a big Chuck Berry fan, judging by the way he plays.
Right, absolutely. And the way they take stage and what have you. And it passes on. Everybody's an influence, and that's the great part about the musical community, as it were.
Yeah, I concur. And you mentioned those themes, like music sounds like it, you heard that beat and you followed it through your life. It gives you something nothing else can. It's hard to understand how music does that, Like the drum's a heartbeat, but there's something about it that touches your soul, and it's amazing how people all the world over are so deeply touched by music.
And how it could, if we didn't allow the rest of it to get in the way, it could really serve to unite us in the world. And, we're in a hateful time, so music is appreciated more than ever.
Sure, it can be a bomb, and I think BALM, not the other kind, and
Right.
brings people together. Like you take the Beatles, and all over the world they probably know who the Beatles are, that's a pretty amazing thing, you know.
Absolutely. You grew up in Queens. I asked you where you went to high school. You said you went to Malloy, and you told me some things after that just shocked me. I had no idea. I wonder if you'd give me a little thumbnail about your experience.
Well, I met some good people and I made some lifelong friends, you know, at least to this point. But I don't think the Alumni Association is going to look for my endorsement. I hated, you know, being there. From before it even started, we had to go to Malloy Camp, which was up in Esopus, which was a week where I caught, I think it's impetigo you call it. And they told me I had acne. I came home, I had to boil my clothes, and from there it was all downhill. For me at least. And, you know, there was a big scandal recently in recent times.
That was uphill, and from there it was downhill.
From there it was even worse downhill. That was a harbinger of what was to come, yeah, for sure. So, yeah, I couldn't stand it. And they were, you know, it was, at the time you don't have, you know, to look back on anything. You know, you're becoming an adult. You're, you know, still in many ways a child. And, you know, you have the brothers teaching you who are dressed in their robes, and you know, like 95% of them wore the robes around school, and you know, a couple wore regular clothes, but you know, they have that image, like, you know, you had mentioned when we spoke a little bit before that, you know, they looked like, seemed to be an intercessor to God, at least the way they were posing. So, you know, you're just learning that as you're there, and you know, it leaves a big possibility for them to take advantage of younger people, and not all of them do that. But you know, at Malloy we had a priest, Father Zatarga, who was on the cover of the Daily News a few years ago, and you know, from those experiences I had to go back and give a deposition to their Park Avenue lawyers, because he was abusing kids for several decades. So if you want to go into that and ask another question, I could leave you with that and see where you want to go from there.
How did you relate with him, and what effect did he have on all of this for you?
Well, is this a family show? How explicit can I be in this?
Yes, we could talk anything, and we are all a family. The family
That sounds
comfortably zoned, where we get together and we talk life as it is, and there are no sponsors involved. There are no you say what you want, and the more you tell me that about this subject, the more I'd be interested, because I have an overall ideology that leads me to want to tell everybody to tax religion, and I'm looking for reasons why. I know a lot of them, but you got an up-close personal one. Talk to me, Bob.
Well, it's funny you said religion, because I looked up what religion meant one day, and I think the definition comes from a word, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, called religarse, and it means to go back into bondage. You know, you're trying to do something to please God, and you never can quite do it, so you're always straining if you believe in that. So aside from that, I always believed there is a God and he's loving, so it was hard to reconcile what was happening, and we were seeing, you know, as 15-year-olds, 14-year-olds, with, you know, those things inside you. You don't have as much perspective to try and separate it. But, you know, I'd been friends with some of my teachers, and you used to get these guidance cards, you know, and you'd have to go in once in a while and they'd meet with you. So I knew who Father Zatarga was, but I hadn't, you know, been chummy with him. And I wasn't in the room 5 minutes when he asked me if I masturbate. So I was 15 years old, but, you know, it's not a question you're going to cop to. So I just said to him, what's the difference to you, you know, and why on earth would you ask me that? And actually at that time I was a junior, so I'd be like 17, but it was, I was fairly formidable. I was playing sports and, you know, lifting weights and this and that. Not that I was a tough guy. I wasn't out to hurt anybody, but I could handle myself, and being from Queens, you have to sometimes, right? So
yes, you do.
I threw out a vibe that was like,
fastest runner in the neighborhood, in my case.
There's nothing wrong with that, you know. I had expensive sneakers too. But it was an off moment, and he looked, terrified, and I sent the vibe off like, you can say that, but if you, touch me or come near me, you're going to go through the wall. And he backed up and he said, well, you're a kid and that would be normal, so this and that. And he was, trying to cover his bases. So the meeting ended awkwardly, and I went and looked for a priest I was friends with, a brother actually, they just don't say mass, they teach. And, I told him immediately what happened. And he believed me, but he said, George said that to you rhetorically. And I said, yeah. And, in reflection now, I realize he must have heard that before. And judging by Zatarga's record, he had. And, he said, well, if you say anything, he's going to say what he told you, that he's telling you that because you're 15 and this and that. And then they're probably going to target you, So I figured I did my part. I told him, and, not realizing he's probably doing this to other people at that time, I went about my way and got out of there. And then when I was not all that long ago.
Would you consider him an enabler?
I think he told me the truth on one level that would have happened. They would have defended him. And what they could do to make me look bad, they probably would have done. I think that part was true. I think he didn't want that to happen.
2 or 3 people doing this, reporting to him, he must, or more, there must have been an indication in his mind. I mean, he must have known, wait a minute, something's not kosher, if you'll excuse me.
I think he believed me, and he knew what you're saying is true. I think he believed me, and he was upset by it, and I knew him for a while, and he himself never did anything like that.
Right.
And I think he told me the truth and what would have happened, but, as an adult later, if I was in his position, I would have gone down myself and spoken to the administration and brought it up. But in light of other things that happened, he had to know.
That's exactly what I was asking.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I probably should have, definitely should have.
It would have saved the pain of a lot of people.
Right. And
to
your credit, you tried to save the pain of a lot of people.
Yeah, I didn't know the scope of what was going on at the time. I learned later. It was a real strange occurrence that led to that, in that I was going for my degree. I got it like a master's in library science. I went back to school later to get that. And I only told one person that I'd seen the newspaper. And this was about 2007. And, that happened to me in 1983. So it went on for all that time. And there was even things recorded before that. So this went on for a long period of time. And I went to one person in school who I trusted. We spoke, and it was before class, and I just said, hey, did you see that story in the Daily News? That Father Zatarga. I said, that guy tried that with me. And she said, oh, my God, Bob, my best friend's nephew is in a case suing him because he tried to molest him recently. So it went on from, about 1982, 83 when I was, a teenager, to now I'm a man going back for my graduate degree, and that priest had still been active and doing these things. And I went to the one person in school.
The fact that you only told one person about that, and they had a nephew involved in the case. That has to be some sort of...
Well, it was their best friend's nephew, and she asked me if I would come forward and testify at that time. So I said yes.
Incredible
it was...
coincidence, though.
Yeah, it blew my mind. I only told one person at school, and it was that person. I was going to CW Post at the time. Yeah. And she said, would you, give your testimony? Because pretty much his guilt was sealed. But they had to prove, not that he did it, but they had to prove that the church knew and still moved him to different places. And unfortunately, in that case, as it went out, they admitted his guilt, in terms of molesting people. But they couldn't prove that the upper echelon of people knew that he'd been doing it. So the kid who sued lost the case. But they didn't deny that he'd been mistreated or molested. But, when I had to testify in a deposition, it was really sickening because in addition to what had happened, their lawyers were on Park Avenue and were defending the priest. They were the top, echelon of lawyers you could get. And it was really sickening that they would hire somebody like that, knowing full well and admitting the priest was guilty. And he admitted to some of it in his own words before he passed away. They knew that. And they still, fought the kid with Park Avenue lawyers. So it's really disgusting, and when you get to see behind the layers of what's going on, that they would, have the money to do that and, basically paying with hard-earned money that people donate, and you're spending this much money to defend people that are guilty.
And I'll tell you who else is donating. The people that don't donate and pay taxes that the church should have paid. So in essence, we who are not involved with the church are supporting the church. And that's one of the reasons I believe in taxing all religions. Not telling you who to root for, so to speak, but non-denominationally, if all of them were taxed and let them compete with astrology and what have you, we could find our own way to find spirituality without paying for it. And at the same time, you could feed the hungry and educate the curious with the tax dollars that would come in. That's another story. Bob, you're a courageous young man.
Well, it's when something like that happens, it's almost like, you'd kill your soul or your insides if you didn't say something and you didn't try to, help somebody. And
But I'm talking initially when it happened, there was a certain amount of courage to stand up to someone who wasn't stood up to much, as it turns out.
Well, you were from Queens, so the attitude that you have to learn when you're younger. So, I was polite and I was a gentle guy, but, when you need to step up and watch out for yourself, you kind of, to whatever ability you can. And, I knew right away this guy's like a $3 bill. I just didn't know at that time how widespread this was and how even this guy, they had to know what he was doing, and I didn't think of other people. But this guy actually kept journals of what he called his nature boys, and this was like even in the Daily News. And he was so sick that when he was caught, he still saved the journals that he wrote in his own handwriting. He just ripped out some pages and must have burned them. I don't know what those had on it because the ones he saved were really sick. But he had like a house in upstate New York that was his family's property. And he'd bring what he called his nature boys up there. And he had them skin. This isn't funny, but it makes me laugh a little because some of the kids who went up were a little more street smart, but, you're dealing with a priest and someone you're told to trust. He had them up there skinny dipping, and he was writing about their different physiques in his journal. So, if you're a parent in that day and age, you think this is somebody you can trust. And,
of course.
He's going up with other kids and such, as some of my friends did, and he's got them skinny dipping in a stream, and he's keeping, books on it. So this was some twisted individual, and I can't believe, the way this guy had also been transferred at times. It begs, it defies belief that they didn't know what he was doing, and I did also tell the one, brother priest that I just mentioned to you.
Right. Oh.
And, that's a sad business, and as you start looking into that, you start to add up numbers of people that to different degrees he had violated or tried to violate. And, the number was greater than, publicly, I think, went in the papers, in my opinion. If you start looking at all things and put some common sense into it, this guy might have chosen his profession because he looks holy to the outside, right? like whitewashed sepulchers in their robes, and then he was in a place where children or kids or young teenagers would be vulnerable to him. So it's kind of a nightmare.
And he's talking to kids at the age that they are indeed most vulnerable. You know, you going through puberty questions and this and that. It's horrible. But when you said that, I harkened back to when I was in the Air Force, stationed at Travis, where they brought. It was during the Vietnam era, and they brought bodies back from Vietnam, from Vietnam, and they would unload them on the flight line. And in my free time, I'd drive out and just watch, sit there for a while, drive around, and hundreds of bodies coming back. And in the Air Force Times, they would report X number of deaths, and it seemed to me, and many others that or a few others that I would take out to the flight line and watch this, that they would never match. The body count would never match. Turns out, just like the church was lying about the figures, the government was lying about the figures. So my initial reason for starting this podcast was that not this particular one, but a podcast in general, was that I wanted to come up against what I called the unholy trinity of government, organized religion, and big business. They all lie to you. They all have that in common, that because of, for whatever reason, the greed of wanting to stay in business forces a certain kind of mistrust that we all have of all three entities. And it's bringing us down. We see it in every walk of life.
Well, Dylan had the song Masters of War, and he said, I wasn't singing so much about soldiers. I was singing more about the military-industrial complex like that Eisenhower had warned everybody about. When you look a little closer at Eisenhower, he might have been a little smarter than we gave him credit for a long time.
I know.
He warned Kennedy.
He's coming down to being the best president we may ever have had. Given everybody is falling off by attrition, so to speak, the more we learn about these guys. Horrible.
And when you think of Kennedy in Vietnam, he was giving him a heads up as to watch yourself. And, when Kennedy died, that whole policy turned around.
Absolutely.
From being, I don't think a soldier had been killed yet in Vietnam. And we still had advisors in there. And if I'm, and after Kennedy died, it's when Johnson sort of ratcheted that up and turned it in. I don't know if they ever called it a war, even though it was, but he certainly brought it about.
It was. I think it was Korea that was never called a war. Called a police action.
Well, I know they say the Vietnam War, but I was wondering, Congress never voted on it and such, right? I mean,
that's
the Gulf of Tonkin came and.
That's interesting.
So I guess that's when we stopped. Congress lost their control over wars.
Brings us to the present, when we have conflict between the president and Congress as to what he can do to either retaliate or start something without Congress.
Rand Paul kind of calls out on that across party lines, and I don't know how many people in power listen to him, but he sure makes the case, that you're not supposed to go into these places without congressional approval, but they do it across parties time after time.
Absolutely. Hey, Bob, we're running to the end. Would you please make sure to come back soon?
Sure. Can I just mention something I have coming out quickly? It's
sure.
A book will be out in January. it's not so much plugging the book, but the story's dear to my heart 'cause it touches on my high school years and what happened a little bit more in depth than I was talking about. It's just called Lost Highway. It's kind of a nod to Hank Williams and Bob Dylan. But that'll be coming out in January, so, I'd love to come back anytime, and it's been interesting, and I enjoy it.
We'll talk. Thank you very, very much. Where will the book be available? Will it be available on Amazon?
It should be on Amazon, and I'll be able to tell you a little more about the publishing next time I'm on, but you'd be able to get it over the Internet.
Beautiful. I'm very much appreciative. Would you do one thing in particular? Send me a link to the George Zatarga.
Zatarga, Father Zatarga.
Zatarga.
Zatarga. And I can send you a link, but if you put in New York Daily News and Father George Zatarga, you'd find some online articles about that. And I can send some to you, certainly.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. I'm going to end this the way I end most of my podcasts. I'm going to ask everybody, you included my friend Bob, to keep your humor dry, keep your kids off the laps of priests that wear dresses, or clerics that wear dresses. That would help.
I'm with you on that.
Thank you, Bob. I'm really thrilled. We had a good time. I hope everybody out there got something out of that. Next time we'll talk a little bit more about sports, because we have the Mets in common. I'm out in Oakland. We've got the A's to talk about, and I love doing that. So let's do that next time, and we'll make it soon.
Well, count on it, and I love the Mets, and I love the Athletics, and thanks for being on my page, the Swinging Oakland A's on Facebook. Right, we get a little plug in for that in your pages, and I thank you for having me, and it's been fun.
My pages basically include. I'm trying to do this date in history on my favorite, if not favorite, my most interesting teams to follow, which are the Mets, the A's, the Giants, the Dodgers, and the Yankees. And I do that on a regular basis. You can look for that on Google. And Comfortably Zoned Network, we aims to please.
Well, that's hot stuff, and I'm looking at your pages, and I thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Be well. Thank you for listening, everybody. Adios.